We are not doing this because of competition between US and China. We're doing this because this is what is ours based on international law. And also, who stood up with us are countries that stands up with us economically also. That's how I understand the Philippine economy.
Three basic categories of economic use. Local livelihoods, so fishers, those who directly depend on the sea for their survival and economic livelihood. Then there's the resource extraction of fish and seabed resources, oil and gas, and of course seabed minerals prospectively. And then there is the sea as a flow space for maritime trade. I won't repeat the statistics. I think we're all familiar with the importance of the South China Sea as a transit point between regions and for major movements of minerals and energy flows from across the world. I'd just like to refer back briefly to President Marcos's keynote, where he mentioned a couple of things in relation to the South China Sea please, if you'd like to fill the seats in front, it might be easier for you to look at the slides as well. So please come up front, don't be shy. President Marcos said that the South China Sea functioned as an economic connector and also as the location of arteries of global commerce. So I think that was wound into the narrative, the keynote narrative. And I think the interest in the South China Sea as a flow space, if I can call it that, for commerce is global and uncontroversial. The more difficult area is around resource extraction, because obviously that gets into the question of who owns what and the claims that are disputed both in sovereignty and in maritime jurisdiction. But we've heard a lot about the UN Law of the Sea. The Law of the Sea itself encourages joint development between disputants, partly to build confidence. So you don't have to sort out your boundaries before you enter into cooperation. It's flexible. It's left up to the flexibility of the disputants themselves to actually do that. And we've seen some attempts, some successful, some less successful already in the South China Sea to do exactly that. There are some examples amongst the ASEAN countries, for example, Brunei and Malaysia, which I think was mentioned in one of our earlier sessions, to move towards progressing their maritime boundary disputes with a view to entering into joint development. I think the key principle on that is, as long as you know where exactly people are claiming, then it's possible to make an arrangement around equity in terms of joint development. Of course, the biggest problem in the South China Sea is the ambiguity about China's claim. So it's very difficult to enter into joint development without that full disclosure. And we've seen, therefore, I think, some attempts to do that. Here in the Philippines a few years ago, some of you will remember the JMSU, the Joint Maritime Survey Undertaking, where there was an attempt to at least to try to move forward on that. But I think that the sticking point there was really around the ambiguity about the extent of the Chinese claim. More recently, however, we've seen Indonesia with under a new president showing a bit more of a pragmatic approach to moving joint development forward with China. Nothing's happened in concrete terms about that, but that's been controversial in Indonesia because it's also run over the long-standing position that China's dispute is not officially recognized. So that's in an interesting state at the moment. I don't know if any of our panelists would like to comment further on that. But just to finish my opening introductory comments, I think that's a key challenge, is how to pursue economic cooperation without giving legitimacy to what is, in legal terms, an illegitimate claim. That's a very thorny challenge to which there's no obvious solution. But I hope that our panelists will be positively inclined to maybe suggest not just the obstacles, but also the potential ways forward. And with that in mind, let's get straight underway with our first panelist, Jonathan Berkshire Miller, who's a senior fellow from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa, Canada. Jonathan, over to you.
Well, this is a great mic as well. It's nice and cozy in here. The good thing that we won't have to worry about shouting at each other, even if it gets heated. It's a nice, cozy environment here. So, Ewan, thanks. You did a great setting there of the scene. So I'm not going to belabor some of the points that you've mentioned. So let me just start with a few stimulating thoughts, and I really hope this is a conversation. One of the benefits of this room here is that we can benefit from everyone in the room's questions and their insights as well. So the first one, and I hate to be a bad student sort of questioning the premise of the teacher here, but when I looked at the onset and the title of this panel and looking at economic security and traditional maritime security and seeing it as a nexus, I think my first overarching point is that we have to get it out of our heads of this old false bifurcation of traditional security on one side, trade and investment and economic security on the other side. And I think the South China Sea is one of the clearest examples of this. It doesn't mean that security has to be everything and that we securitize the entire discussion. But I think that we do have to recognize that when we're talking about some of the economic security equities in this region, you highlighted a number of them. Of course, the energy choke points, the livestock here, the fish, et cetera, is very important for the food security of the region and for the energy security, not just of littoral states in the South China Sea, but all the way from Manila to Montreal, from Singapore to Santiago. I mean, this is what happens in the South China Sea reverberates beyond the South China Sea. But I think the first important point is that we need to get away from this false bifurcation of economic security and traditional security on the one hand. The second part is sort of why this nexus matters, and I think you sort of went into this very importantly. Was, of course, we have the trade side, we have the energy side, but it goes beyond that. And I think I'm hoping that we get into this through the panel, is the importance of involving private sector actors. If we're talking about economic security, this is not something that we're going to figure out just governments themselves, but this goes into shipping companies, this goes into insurance questions. This is more than just a discussion that can be resolved through ASEAN-related forums or through government-to-government discussions. This absolutely is something that needs to be held in a public-private discussion as well. So that's the second point. Of course, we could belabor the point on why the nexus matters, but we all know how critical of an artery the South China is for the economies of the littoral states, but more broadly, the world. And I don't need to belabor on this panel some of the data points and the financial points on that. The third sort of point is that economic coercion, and I think that's actually come up. It came up in the last panel. It's come up throughout the conference. Is a design feature that's not unique to the South China Sea. I think many partners in the broader Indo-Pacific and actually some of our European friends have been suffering from different layers of economic coercion. So when we're talking, I mean, we could use a number of different examples from arbitrary import bans, tourism cutoffs, investment freezing, informal embargoes. There's so many different examples we could use. But is that when we're talking about this needs to be a constant feature and design feature of our discussions with some of the like-minded groups that we're having these conversations with, is that economic coercion is a reality, and we should be learning some of the experiences that are not necessarily in the South China Sea and how they reflect on the situation here in Southeast Asia. This sort of leads me just to kind of finish up a few of my points, is sort of the so what do we do about it? And I think part of this is, of course, dialogue is important. I don't think this all needs to be about resilience and finding like-minded groups that we can have diversification and redundancy. I think we do have to have dialogue and discussion, and I'm hoping today that we hear a lot of that discussion amongst our panel. But I think it does lead me to some of the other points on what we can be doing and what we should be doing. I do think the diversification question, looking at some of the main areas that are being weaponized through economic coercion, which state parties or which actors, which private sector parties could help us in having those supply chains being more resilient. So just to give you one example on critical minerals, I think that there's other players outside of the South China Sea that could help fill some of that void in case there's economic coercion that's being leveraged on some of the littoral actors in Southeast Asia on critical minerals. Energy security, I think, is another factor. It seems like a selfish plug as a Canadian to say that we're an option as well, but you could traverse through the Western Pacific and not have to worry about the South China Sea. You may have to worry about the Arctic and other factors, but there are other supply chains that can get some of those resources to you. The sort of last thing I'll mention here, as far as some of the things that we can do, just a few ideas, is this is not just a international discussion about what we could do with some of our partners, but it's also a domestic discussion. So I know we've been talking cooperatively here about what we should be doing together, but I think we need to be soul searching a lot domestically about actually thinking about what economic security means to us in this context. So if we're having this conversation about the nexus between economic security and maritime security, we have to be honest with ourselves that many of our ministries don't even have a setup or forensic design to actually to have real robust discussions on economic security. We also don't have, going to my first point, many of us don't have the real good mechanisms to engage with our private sector actors to, number one, to hear their reflections, to hear their stories on this, but to really drive forward a program that truly is public-private by nature. So I think that's, a point I want to leave on and get some reflections from other states in the region, what sort of steps you've done, both from a government perspective, but also to engage with your private sector on this discussion of economic security. And just sort of finally, I would mention infrastructure protection, I think, is a really important one, too, that we should be thinking about. We all rely and we all benefit on some of the infrastructure in the region. And if it's being leveraged or if coercion is being used against some of those infrastructure projects, of course, undersea cables, we had a robust discussion on that already here in this dialogue is one example of it, but there's many other examples of infrastructure that benefits all. But if it's being leveraged for one or two parties' interests, that's something that I think we need to come to terms with and have a discussion on. So I'll leave it there for now and really look forward to the conversation.
Great. Well, that was a really helpful opener, Jonathan. Not simply a Canadian perspective, but I think you took forward the challenge to put some flesh on the bones of those broad contours, reminding us also of that critical link to bring governments and private sector actors together, and just relating that back, since you are from Canada, it's apparent to me that Canada's not well known for beating its own drum, you might say, but it is a consistent presence in the South China Sea and has actually stepped up, from its modest base of capabilities to be, I think, quite impressively present in the South China Sea, not always necessarily with a big asset, but even an offshore patrol vessel counts, because I think the point from a government perspective, presence legally and diplomatically makes the point in a way that making statements from Ottawa maybe doesn't. You've also made the point that Canada is there as an economic actor too, both in the South China Sea, but also because of its strong minerals base and in rare earths, also clearly, I think, a more important actor in the future. We'll go in the order that appears in the guidelines. So now I'd like to turn for a Philippines perspective to Professor Victor Manet, who is the President and CEO of Strat-Based Group. Victor, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. Allow me to share some slides. So we might need to tilt a little, but we've argued in the Philippines that there's really this confluence of national security and economic security in trade and investments. And it is something that we have advocated, we have spoken about in the Philippines, and we put it in the broader context of the Indo-Pacific region, and we see how the Philippines has this strategic importance. When you see the map in a different way, when you speak of sea lanes, trade routes, data connectivity, even critical minerals, we have our own sources, and even supply chain diversification. Especially when you look at sea lanes, even the United Nations Conference on Trade reflects the importance of the West Philippine Sea. But when I speak of the West Philippine Sea, I always remind everyone that we're not talking about the South China Sea. It's what is given to us as our exclusive economic zone, our territorial seas, based on the UNCLOS. And through time, even though there is a claim that there is that 9-dash line, our own archipelagic sea lanes law, our own maritime zones, defines what we consider as ours. And that is what we try to protect maritime-wise. And within those seas, we see trade sea lanes passing through us. We see submarine cables. And this kind of reality really tells us how we connect our own maritime security with even the global geoeconomic situation. Some would even say confrontation. But in our case, our maritime security initiatives is actually supported by countries that are strong economic partners of the Philippines. Not only from data, which I'll share later, but even from our own public, the people itself. My institute, since 2013, have tracked how Filipinos view these countries. And those who have really stepped up in being with us in defending what we have won based on the arbitral award of 2016 reflects also our partners in the economy. There is this misconception, especially when you look at trade in the Philippines, we are the outlier in the ASEAN region. Our economy is not tied up to China. We are independent of China. And we have long argued that when we filed the case in January 2013 as compared to other ASEAN countries. We even have a negative or a big deficit vis-a-vis China, even our own investments. And when you look at our source of investments also, again, these are the countries that stand up with us in the maritime front. And maybe that makes us more independent in thinking. That makes us define what is our national interest vis-a-vis maritime, our territorial seas, our exclusive economic zones, because it also reflects our strong relationship. I always joke when you see Singapore there, these are basically multinational companies from the US and Europe who are based in Singapore. And when you look at this data, it reflects how we see in our own assertion. The latest data we had is just a few weeks back, is that these are the countries that stand up with us through time. And it reflects, again, these are across geographic area of the Philippines, across demographic area of the Philippines. And I share Dr. Miller's point of view that we need to bring the private sector. That's why when I look at the world, that maybe the economic fragmentation of the world today, and as we navigate this, I know there's a role for the state. But the state needs to engage with the private sector. Especially in the Philippines, we're heavy on the private sector. Heavy in different industries, they're the ones that create jobs. But the private sector, as they bring investment that has driven growth in our country, it's also investment coming from like-minded countries that share with us the belief that we live in a rules-based order, and we are here with you, the Philippines and these countries, standing up for international law and defending, on our part, we will defend what is our maritime rights, our territorial integrity, but also work with like-minded countries, but also work with neighbors to ensure peace and stability. And we have long advocated this in Stratbase. That's why we have fully supported this dialogue to get people to talk. We've also hosted discussions with the private sector and even the international community. So we jump from this opportunity to speak, to discuss, to share. I'll leave it with this, conscious of the time.
Marvelous. That was very concise and helpful, and brought things obviously back to where we are, the perspective on how the Philippines economy has developed. And I think it underlines the point that was made by our first presenter, that there isn't a false bifurcation between economics and security. The diverse base that you've underlined in terms of the trade structure of Philippines partners underlines, I think there's a heavy overlay with the growth in security partnerships too, which suggests that the two are closely linked. I just wanted to pick up maybe just a specific question, if I'm right in understanding this, but we talked about energy further, and if we could drill down, if you excuse the pun, to explore that in a little bit more detail, because the Philippines is, as far as I know, the only one of the littoral states in the South China Sea that currently doesn't have a major oil and gas project underway. Now, maybe I'm wrong in that understanding, and I'm maybe out of date. But given that the population of the Philippines is now well over 100 million people, if you were to put that, for example, into Europe, it would be by far the largest European state. Yet, in the Filipino mentality, sometimes we hear that it's a small country, but you have a large population growing fast with energy needs obviously going to continue to increase. To what extent is the South China Sea, or the West Philippine Sea, as I should say, in terms of your EEZ, how are you planning for that, both private sector and government wise, for the potential to bring gas and to the extent that there's oil here online?
In the case of the Philippines, we have few developments, even within, not at the West Philippine Sea. So we have our own big gas operation developed by Chevron and Shell a few years back, and we're still drilling. I tend to say we because I'm the advisor of this project. I wear that other hat to support the institute. And there are a lot of interest also in, you'd say, areas that is well within our thoughts. But our problem really started, since you mentioned it even earlier, the JMSU. There's a place we call it Rectobank. It was never questioned. It was never disputed. Suddenly, after the Joint Maritime Seismic Understanding of 2008, 2007, it became part of the dispute. And that's one of the reasons. People think we filed the case in 2013. Again, I say we because I was one of the advisors at the time. Because we did not file the case only because of Scarborough Shoal. But our exploratory consortium trying to study the recto bank for future extraction, as we call it, of their natural gas, was being harassed in that area. And that's one of the reasons. And that's also part of the result of the arbitration, that this is within our exclusive economic zone. So it's something that we continue to, we know it might be a flashpoint to continue. That's why the consortium has been suspended from further pushing. There was a time that I was even shepherding the entry of Western companies, but suddenly they back out because of strong pressure from Beijing. ExxonMobil, Shell. So I'm sharing some of my consulting secrets here now for your question. But we continue. There are a lot of engagement. There was an attempt even to talk to CNOC in the previous administration, but our concern was it has to be within our laws. And I think the last visit of President Xi here, he was open to sign a memorandum of agreement with our government then, but I think our government 24 hours before suddenly said it had to be from the Philippine laws. If not, because our president then, his name is Duterte, would have been charged with treason if he signed that agreement. So that's why from there it's been put on hold, that area. But the rest of the country, there are a lot of attempt side by side with the development of renewables, offshore, solar. But natural gas would be a good transition for us, especially, as you've said earlier, the growing population.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that. The Recto Bank is the Philippine name, but Reed Bank is
Reed Bank. Yeah, sorry, it's a Reed
same.
Bank.
It's the same,
Same, the Reed
thing
Bank.
we're talking about. Great. Well, that might be a challenge that our fourth speaker might want to take up as well, given that you've referenced the previous attempts to push cooperation forward with China, and that from the Philippines' perspective is an option that remains open.